While I was going through my bachelor's studies in South Africa, I did not think that I will be involved in the programs of internationalization of German universities and work with international students of different religions and Christian denominations who come to Germany to study intercultural theology. And I certainly did not imagine back then that I would be in front of a Belarusian audience. Likewise, I doubt that you imagined one day you would be listening to someone from 10,000 kilometers away sharing their thoughts with you on contextual theology. It is an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you and hear your thoughts and opinions on my lecture today. I would like to talk about two topics. Firstly, about womanism, which I emphasize differs from feminism, and secondly, about the methods of contextual Bible study. Both of these topics I see as relevant for the contemporary life in South Africa, and I see how the experience and the historical path of South Africa can be theoretically and practically interesting for the global world. South Africa institutionalized racial segregation and lived under the system of apartheid from 1948 until 1994. This regime was supported theologically and practically by some Christian churches, which complicates the religious scene in South Africa and contributes to the ambivalent attitude to Christianity, to which about 80% of the population belong. Nowadays, traditional African religions are practiced in South Africa independently, as well as integrated into the Christian beliefs and practices. The social situation in South Africa is complicated by the rates of poverty, crime, and disease. South Africa, unfortunately, has 7.1 million people living with HIV, and about 80% of the population are infected with the bacteria for tuberculosis, and there are about 450,000 active cases of TB each year. And to top all of that, the country has one of the highest rates of violent crime and rape in the world. Before I could continue, could you maybe quickly turn to the person next to you and quickly discuss what do you know about feminism, womanism, and do you have any idea what contextual Bible study could be? What do you know about feminism, womanism, and what is contextual Bible study?
I'm sure about womanism, nothing.
Okay, so just quickly turn to the person next to you and discuss for a minute, and then we'll see if you have any idea whatsoever. Judging by their silence, I guess it would be...
Адольф предлагает обсудить это друг с другом.
Judging by their silence, I would assume that that means absolutely nothing, which is great for me. Before I turn to womanism and its connection to contextual theology, I have to take a step back and describe a little bit of how womanism emerged from feminism. Feminism is a term that most are familiar with today. However, unfortunately, the wider public often is not aware of the history of its development or have only heard about the bad connotations it has acquired over the years. Feminism aims to have equality between the sexes. This could be found linguistically, as for example in English, when we say the word man, when we're actually referring to humanity, while only focusing on half of it. Feminism aimed to achieve this equality in all spheres, such as social, political, economic, religious, among other issues, such as equal rights in marriage, parenting, and custody of children. What became known as the first wave of feminism started around the 1830s in the United Kingdom and focused on legal issues. It included the right for women to have custody of their children in the case of a divorce. passing this law made it possible for other laws to be put in place which allowed married women to own property and the right to vote. One of the first countries to allow women to vote was New Zealand, and they passed the law in 1893. It was not until 1919 that the United States of America made it possible for women to vote. And surprisingly, Switzerland only granted the right to vote for women in, any guesses? 1971, quite recently. The main concern and battle of the first wave feminists were to tackle legal issues, while a very small group of women were also raising the issue of reproductive and economic rights as well. Now I turn to the second wave of feminism. By the 1960s in the United States of America, the idea of equality between men and women had 40 years of experience. It was time that women felt this was not enough, and they began to address issues that up till this point were silenced. They continued to deal with legal issues, but they broadened the scope to include socio-cultural inequalities found in family life and the workplace. Within family life, in many countries, women were not allowed to work without the written consent of their husband. And furthermore, marital rape was not criminalized. In 1963, Betty Friedan published the book The Feminine Mystique, which voiced the concerns of American women of the time. The book raised new issues and brought out the term the second wave of feminism, which was largely concerned with gender discrimination. Out of the second wave, feminism developed different ideas such as third wave feminism, black feminism, and, which we will eventually get to, womanism.
So it's the same as the third wave of feminism. Womanism is the same, yeah?
Very similar, but no.
Okay.
Good question. So I'll quickly look at third wave womanism and then explain black feminism and womanism. So the term third wave womanism was coined in 1992 by Rebecca Walker in her article Becoming the Third Wave. In this article, she addressed the testimony of Anita Hills, who was sexually harassed by Clarence Thomas. Now, Clarence Thomas was nominated for the Supreme Court of the United States. So the idea that someone in such a powerful position and who was meant to represent what is right and wrong in the country outraged feminists. The third wave brought on numerous new issues which they felt the second wave did not deal with or were incapable of addressing at the time. The third wave dealt with issues of gender stereotypes and included women with diverse racial and cultural identities. Many new terms and ideas emerged, such as the key term intersectionality, which basically argues that social categorizations such as gender, race, and class are all interconnected, and therefore discrimination overlaps among these social groups. Other issues such as ecofeminism, which supports the idea of vegetarianism, claiming that oppression of any sort, including dominion over animals, is inappropriate. A major critique that the third wave feminists had of second wave feminism was in only highlighting the voices of upper middle class white women. But in the same way that there were a few women in the first wave who fought for reproductive and economic rights, there were also women in the second wave who did fight for equal treatment of people of different races. And just as a point of interest, there is a fourth wave as well, which started in 2012, and essentially it looks at the role of women in the 21st century in social media. But let me not get carried away. And finally turn to the concept of womanism. At first glance, it does seem that third-wave feminism, black feminism, and womanism are all the same thing. But they are all offshoot ideas from second-wave feminism. The third wave brought in the theory of intersectionality, while black feminism, as Kimberly Crenshaw explains it, argues that the experience of, on the one hand, being black and being a woman are two separate things. In that way, it is a double discrimination of being black and of being a woman. These social categories are then explored independently, but also combined. Womanism, on the other hand, proposes that culture and femininity form the experience of a woman's existence. The focal point of womanism is the culture, as opposed to class. This approach argues that the color of a woman's skin is not a part of her femininity. Instead, the color of her skin is a lens through which she understands her femininity. The term womanism was coined by Alice Walker, and it addresses the limits of feminism and black feminism. It hopes to seek equality of both sexes by not blatantly attacking men, as feminism is often critiqued for. Further, it acknowledges the black experience, but attempts a more universal approach for women of all groups, be it class, race, color, and sexual orientation. Although that was the ideal approach of Alice Walker, Clenora Hudson Weems further developed womanism into what she calls Africana womanism. And the reason why she says Africana and not African is it's the Latin feminine form, for those who are interested. The term Africana womanism rejects feminism as a possible tool for African women because it is a Eurocentric based ideology. Hudson Weems also distances Africana womanism from black feminism, which is an African American ideology, which is also mostly based on a Western worldview. If feminists aimed for the equality of all sexes and races and people, they seemed to only focus on achieving that goal for upper-class white women. It was as if white upper-class feminists wanted to be treated better, but did not think it necessary for black women to be treated better. A similar problem was brought up by black Americans, that the black liberation movement sought for better treatment of black people, but not necessarily for black women. This meant that black women were oppressed by black men and white women. This critique was especially relevant in South Africa under the apartheid regime, where black women were oppressed by white men, women, and children, and further they were oppressed by black men. Black South African women live in a society which supports the role of a dowry, known in South Africa as lobola, where a man essentially has to buy his wife from his father-in-law through the payment of cattle. Her price may go up if she is beautiful and educated, and will decrease if she is uneducated or is not a virgin. While the official South African law allows for a woman to own property, tribal laws complicate the matter, only allowing married women with children to own property, and even in that case, men will most likely still control the property. To draw a parallel to the case of Clarence Thomas, who sexually harassed Anita Hills, the previous president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, was accused of raping a woman, but still became president, and although monogamy is the official law of the country, former President Jacob Zuma managed to practice polygamy and marry 6 wives at the same time. His example reflects that polygamy is still practiced and support within various national groups in South Africa. The practice of polygamy also further complicates the issue of inheritance, as well as the socio-cultural perception of masculine power. This is because if one man has 5 wives and each wife have a few children, in such a large family there are most likely going to be quarrels. And the only person that can solve those quarrels is the father. So this father becomes even more powerful, which creates the cultural perception that a man is powerful and should subjugate over women. This idea is further perpetuated in the religious system of ancestral veneration. Ancestral veneration stems from the belief that God is a distant God and common folk do not have access to him. Thus, ancestors act as mediaries. In some ways, it is similar to the Catholic and Orthodox practice of venerating saints. Naturally, people would turn to powerful ancestors, as the perception is that they will have more power to grant people their wishes. And the most powerful were, as this system created, men. This is not to say that native African and South African tribal systems were all bad, but the combination of African and European laws certainly made the restrictions and limitations for women more and more diverse, complex, and controversial. As Mercy Amba Uduyoye phrases in her poem, telling the life story of African women through beads, an extract, "Other beads, they have come from over the seas. They are glass and easily shattered. Created by humans, they can be ground back to powder and remodeled." Christian values and the traditional worldview combined often made women unable to act as ethical subjects, being criticized and silenced by one or both systems. The social, political, economic, religious, and cultural systems in Africa made for the oppression against women more salient. It is understandable how the experiences and concerns that were raised by Black American women did not address the concerned voices of the African experience. I could take the critique one step further in that the academics that created the terms such as womanism and Africano-womanism are Americans or Americans of West African, mostly Nigerian and Ghana descent, and therefore they did not bring the voice of women from other African countries. By attempting to unify diverse thoughts by giving it one name, we take away the voice of many. The issues brought up by Nigerians are important, but they do not address the issue of their distant neighbors, the South Africans, which are over 6,000 kilometers away. It would be similar to claim that the Belarusian experience of a woman will be the same for women in India. Context is everything, and with this in mind, I now turn to the method of contextual Bible studies. But before we get there, I would like to play a little game called Do Not Answer. Yes, but I'll explain, then you can translate. So the game is called Do Not Answer. You have to ask someone a question, and they are not allowed to answer. The person left of that person has to answer on their behalf. So, for example, if I ask you, how old are you? Then the person next to you should answer on your behalf. She is 92 years old. Or rather, I am 92 years old. Yes.
Суть игры заключается в том, что вы спрашиваете вопрос у любого человека, которого хотите, но он не может вам на этот вопрос ответить, и человек, который сидит слева или справа от него, как получится удобнее, должен ответить на этот вопрос. И игра должна, я не знаю, по кругу двигаться, да? То есть мы можем, наверное, с нас начать.
Я должна спросить...
задать вопрос, да, затем человек слева, или так
Whatever you
получается,
want.
да, слева отвечает.
Любой вопрос.
Абсолютно.
Любой вопрос и любой человек.
Ты боишься пауков?
И теперь человек слева отвечает на это.
Ты должна ответить.
Я? Ты должна ответить.
Да, за левую.
Не за себя, а за...
За... Ну, конечно,
другого
он
человека.
боится. Теперь ты спрашиваешь. Меня или по кругу Оля, значит. Вы любите кофе? Да, Оля любит кушать. Дальше я. Солнышко.
Не ходи двигаться.
У меня нет вопроса.
Some ideas, how many children do you have, what's your favorite color, what's your hobby?
Да, задавать стандартные вопросы из биографии, например.
Не знаю.
Не стесняйся.
Не знаю, сколько детей.
Нет, так
Сколько у тебя детей?
сколько тебе лет? 28.
Когда будет защита диссертации?
Через год.
Вы дадите определение вуманизма? Без вопросов. Это вопрос, да.
Ты счастлива?
Да.
Вас устраивает ваша работа? Are you satisfied with your job?
Самые лучшие работы в мире.
Did you draw a conclusion?
Okay, so we saw a pattern emerging that a group of women, the first feminists, second, third, fourth feminists, all imposed their worldview on the rest of the world. They assumed that, of course, people were scared, that they don't have children, that they are very active and able to finish their dissertation in a year, and that they're extremely happy in their work. As for the reality, things were a bit different. And just like this little game, the answers they gave on behalf of others were mostly wrong. With this, I turn to a method which tries to circumnavigate this problem: contextual Bible studies. I believe in order to prevent the issue of constantly critiquing the forebearers, we can simply ask the community what they need. It is through the method of contextual Bible studies, as it was developed in South Africa, Pietermaritzburg, and contextual theology that we can learn more about what South African women might mean for South African context. Bearing in mind that post-apartheid South Africa is represented by 11 official languages and many diasporic groups of vast backgrounds, and hence is called the Rainbow Nation, how can we understand what the context of a group truly is? The traditional method of interpreting any social phenomenon was that academics and policymakers in their ivory towers read texts and shared their so-called scientific interpretation, and this was handed down to the community through an authoritative figure. But as we can see from all the different waves and subcurrents of feminism, black feminism, womanism, Africana womanism, what the officials say and what people actually experience and need are two very different things. The contextual method turns interpretation around, not first asking the so-called official experts, but rather turning directly to people and asking them how they are being oppressed and what they think they need to ease the situation. This type of biblical studies was practiced at my alma mater, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Pietermaritzburg. Instead of interpreting biblical texts based on their original meaning in Hebrew or Greek, we went to communities and presented them with a text and asked them how they deal with it based on their experiences. This included talking with rape victims about the text of Dinah and Tamar, or talking with people that have lost their job about the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Much of contextual Bible studies rely on liberation theology, in that the texts are not presented to the community in order to have interesting interpretations, but to serve the community and to liberate them from their oppression. The most well-known form of liberation theology is what developed in the Catholic Church in South Africa in the 1950s and 60s. It was an attempt to curb issues of poverty and resulted in a new, innovative theological methodology which theologizes not from the perspective of exegesis or policymakers and those in power, but rather from the grassroots, from the perspective of the poor and oppressed. Contextual Bible study is a means of interpreting biblical texts through the environment of the text. This means an African will read the Bible and inherently make Christ more African. An Asian will read the text and attribute Asian characteristics and thought processes, and of course, a Belarusian will have a Belarusian form of Christianity. This means readers of the text interpret the text according to their own environment and make their own interpretations. The priests can fight as much as they wish to give an official story to what the text really means, but they cannot prevent the ordinary readers at home reading their Bible and understanding it in whatever way they do. As opposed to fighting this, contextual theology embraces it and asks what alternative interpretations can this reading of the Bible give, and more importantly, how can it serve to add value and help those who are oppressed. A contextual Bible study may be a misleading term. Often participants say, this is far from what we do at church. The center that facilitates contextual Bible studies in Pietermaritzburg goes to communities and helps them to overcome their social pains. The method of contextual Bible studies draws intensely on liberation theology, claiming that social change is impossible without the presence of poor people, as they are the specialists for their own improvement, and they have the resources to bring about positive change. In this way, to learn about how gendered violence and discrimination are understood and perceived in South Africa, the method of contextual Bible studies does not turn to Hebrew and Greek, but rather to the very group they want to learn more about, women that have knowledge and experience of gender-based violence and discrimination. Their knowledge is fundamental to an examination of gender discrimination, and their experience gives the necessary rationale to form an action plan to bring about positive social change in their community. The skeptics among you are probably thinking that people do not know what they want, and by asking the community how they can deal with their problems is like asking alcoholics how to become sober. I give an example. An international airline asked their customers in a survey what they wanted, and the majority of them said, "We want more legroom," even if it meant costing more. And when the airline gave them more legroom, everyone realized they don't want more legroom, they want cheaper flights. This anecdote simply suggests to take the advice of the conventional experts, but to synthesize it with the knowledge of the community, while learning what people are actually suffering from and what kind of help they expect. So how does contextual Bible studies meet the concerns of women? The contextual Bible study method makes use of the community's interpretation and experience as well as that of the experts. A contextual Bible study is a three-pronged approach based on the idea of see, judge, and act. The first step, to see, asks the community to look at the reality of their situation. What are their experiences and what resources do they have? To objectively look at the situation. The second step is to judge, or rather how to deal with the text or situation. This is a more complicated step which has 4 parts to it. Firstly, a text is given to the community and they are asked to interpret it without any promptings. The community shares their interpretation, their experience, their feelings. This is what is called an in front of the text reading. It's called in front of the text because they're not interested about the text or the social history behind the text. They're interested in what's in front of the text, namely the person reading it. After this in front of the text reading, the facilitator provides an on the text reading or in the text reading, where he or she does a literary reading and analysis, looking precisely what is found in the text. Then a behind the text reading is given, where socio-historical aspects shed further light on the text. This is mostly done by someone trained in theology, psychology, or sociology. Lastly, the community is asked to bring all of these interpretations together, given a second in front of the text reading. And this brings us to the step of acting. All of this is not done in vain, but with the sole purpose of providing an action plan for the community, which is represented by the step act, which is informed by re-looking at the reality, experiences, and resources of the community with these new tools at hand. To conclude, the 4 waves of feminism, as well as black feminism, womanism, and Africana womanism, and even South Africana womanism, if you will, have valid critiques of each other and constructive arguments how to improve the situation for women, whether this meant only black women, only African women, or indeed women in the broader sense all around the globe. But using the method of contextual Bible study, it gives them voice to the community and asks the oppressed groups to speak up for themselves and aids them in developing tools to better the situation, as opposed to academics and armchair philosophers claiming what the voice of the oppressed is, and how many children they have, and when they're going to finish their dissertation. The contextual Bible study method synthesizes the best of both worlds, taking the living voice of the community and sharpening it with the scientific tools of the academic afterwards. Moreover, this method enables women to be heard within the community and suggests to take action, addressing both women and men. The task of a facilitator in a contextual Bible study is very complex. It requires high empathy and sensitivity to the people's context and respect to their different life choices. The ability to listen, summarize, and critically and academically process the received opinions and needs. It represents a church leadership which is not oppressive, authoritarian, and moralistic, but rather inclusive, respectful, and liberating. People are seen as the specialists for their own improvement, those who do not need to be further oppressed, silenced, and subjugated by church representatives, but liberated and be given a voice of their own. Thank you.